The first day Kevin arrived to live at the Los Alamos residential complex, he was 16 years old, with a box of science fiction books under his arm and the quiet hope that this place would be different from the previous ones. His mother had secured that apartment after 2 years on a waiting list, and she celebrated with a bottle of cheap wine and a pizza they ate sitting on the floor because there was still no furniture. "Do you like it?" she asked him, looking at the white, empty walls. "I'm going to like it," Kevin answered, and he meant it. The apartment was number 4B, on the second floor of a cream-colored building with leaks in the hallway ceiling and an elevator that worked every other day. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. It had a large window in the living room that looked out onto the inner courtyard, where a rubber tree cast shade over a concrete bench in the afternoons. Kevin imagined himself reading there. He imagined himself at peace. That peace lasted exactly 4 days. The first problem was named Marco, lived in 4A, right next door, and had the habit of listening to music at stadium volume from 11 at night until 2 in the morning. It wasn't that the music was bad, it was that it passed through the walls as if they were wet paper, and Kevin, who had to be up early for school the next day, would lie staring at the ceiling with his eyes wide open counting the minutes. The first night he thought it was a coincidence. The second night he knocked on the wall with his knuckles. The third night he knocked on the door of 4A with a mixture of nerves and exhaustion that trembled in his hands. Marco opened it with a beer in his hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was around 40, his greasy hair plastered to his forehead, wearing a T-shirt with an old stain at chest height. Behind him, 2 men Kevin didn't know watched from the sofa with bored expressions. "New neighbor," Marco said, stretching the word out as if it were an insult disguised as a greeting. "Yeah. I'm Kevin. I live next door. The music is very loud and I have school tomorrow. Could you turn it down a little?" Marco looked him up and down, then looked at his friends, then looked back at Kevin with that smile that wasn't a smile. Sure, he said, and closed the door. The music didn't go down, it went up. Kevin went back to his room, pulled the pillow over his head, and learned a lesson that night that would take him years to fully process. There are people who interpret kindness as weakness, and once they see you that way, they don't stop. The other 2 troublesome neighbors came into his life more gradually but just as inevitably. Sandra lived in 4C, across the hall. A woman in her mid-30s with 2 large dogs she never cleaned up after in the courtyard and a sharp tongue she used generously whenever someone said something she didn't like. And then there was Danny, from 3B, directly below Kevin's apartment, a young man with a perpetually bored expression who had turned the ceiling of his apartment, that is, the floor of Kevin's, into his personal drum. He banged with a broomstick every time Kevin walked, moved a chair, or, apparently, breathed too loudly. During the first months, Kevin's mother, Laura, tried to mediate. She knocked on doors, left friendly notes, spoke with the building management. The administrator, a man with the surname Torres who always wore the same gray jacket and smelled of mothballs, listened with a look of concern and did absolutely nothing. "These are matters between neighbors," he would say, shrugging as if he were describing the weather. "My son can't sleep," Laura would reply. "Talk to them directly." "We already talked to them." "Then talk more calmly." Laura would leave that office with her jaw clenched and Kevin would wait for her in the hallway knowing the outcome in advance. In time they stopped going. It was like talking to a wall, except the wall at least didn't look at you with condescension. The years passed with that rough texture that things have when they don't change no matter how much you want them to. Kevin finished school with good grades in spite of everything, studied computer technology at a night institute because he worked during the day at an electronics store downtown, and built his life with the quiet patience of someone who learned from a young age that no one is going to come solve their problems. At 19 his mother moved to live with her sister in another city, and Kevin stayed alone in 4B with a lease in his name and the quiet determination not to let himself be driven out. Marco kept up with the music. Sandra kept up with the dogs and the comments. Danny kept up with the broomstick. And sometimes all 3 acted together, as if there were an invisible coordination between them, as if the shared objective were to make life impossible for the young man in 4B who wouldn't leave and wouldn't break. There was a period, when Kevin was 22, when things escalated in a way that forced him to call the police for the first time. Marco had started parking his truck behind Kevin's car in the parking lot, blocking it completely, and when Kevin asked him to move it, Marco would take hours to appear, always with that same warmthless smile. "Easy, neighbor, I'm coming," he would say, and then take another 40 minutes. The police came, took a report, explained to Marco that he couldn't block other people's vehicles, and Marco nodded with the expression of a model citizen. The next morning Kevin's car appeared with a long scratch running the length of the driver's door. There were no cameras at that angle of the parking lot. Kevin knew because he had checked himself. Sandra, for her part, had perfected the art of domestic psychological warfare. When Kevin arrived loaded with groceries and used the elevator, she would appear in the hallway and make comments out loud that were technically not directed at anyone. "Some people live here as if this were a hotel," she would say, staring at no fixed point while her dogs pulled at their leashes. Or on another occasion, "The problem with this building is that they no longer know who they rent to." Kevin learned not to respond. He learned to look straight ahead, open his door, and go inside, but that wasn't free either. Every silence swallowed left something. A small sediment that accumulated somewhere in the chest that has no exact name but hurts all the same. Danny was the most unpredictable of the three. He would go weeks without doing anything and then, without apparent reason, start with the broomstick at midnight, or shout from his apartment phrases that filtered through Kevin's floor with unsettling clarity. Once Kevin went downstairs and knocked on the door of 3B, and Danny opened it with an expression that mixed surprise with something resembling satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for exactly that. "What do you want?" Danny asked. "The noise," said Kevin, keeping his voice steady even though it cost him. "It's already 12:30. "What noise? I don't hear anything." "The banging on the ceiling." "I don't know what you're talking about." It was at that moment that Kevin understood it wasn't carelessness or obliviousness. It was intentional. It always had been. And that certainty, far from making him explode, calmed him in a strange way. Because when you know exactly what you're up against, you can prepare yourself. He started keeping a record. A notebook at first, then a folder on his computer. Dates, times, descriptions. Photos when possible. Audio recordings when his phone could pick something up. He didn't do it out of anger. He did it with the cold methodology of someone who knows that one day they're going to need proof. He didn't yet know of what exactly, but he kept it. It was around that time, at 23, that he met Mia. He met her at work. She came into the store to exchange a broken charger and they ended up talking for 40 minutes about 90s movies because Kevin had a poster of The Fifth Element behind the counter and Mia had a very firm opinion about Bruce Willis that Kevin found fascinating. They went out the following weekend. Within a month she already knew the story of the building, the three neighbors, the record-keeping notebook, everything. "And why don't you leave?" she asked him one night, not with cruelty but with genuine curiosity. Kevin thought over the answer for a moment. "Because it's my home," he said finally, "and I didn't do anything wrong." Mia looked at him with that expression she sometimes had, a mix of tenderness and something resembling admiration, and said no more. But from that night she started staying over more often in 4B, and over time she left a drawer of clothes, then a toothbrush, then a small aloe vera plant on the windowsill, and so, without anyone officially declaring it, the apartment stopped being just Kevin's apartment and became the place of the two of them. The neighbors, of course, found new ways to make their presence felt. Marco started making comments about Mia when he saw her in the hallway. Nothing explicitly offensive, but the kind of comment you can't ignore and that is designed precisely for that. Sandra once told her, with all the venomous sweetness she was capable of producing, that it was very brave of her to stay in that apartment with everything that was said about the tenant. Mia responded with a smile so perfectly polite that Sandra didn't know what to do with it, and that brightened Kevin's entire day. Danny, for a change, intensified the banging on the nights Mia stayed over, as if he knew exactly when she was there. Kevin never understood how he knew, but he noted it in his folder all the same. And so they arrived at that Tuesday in October when Kevin was 24 years old, had been living in 4B for 8 years, and the world decided he still hadn't had enough. It had been a long week. Kevin had worked double shifts because a coworker was on sick leave. He'd been sleeping poorly for days due to a combination of stress and Marco's usual noise, and he ate when he could between shifts. Mia had noticed he looked pale on Monday, but he had told her it was tiredness, that it would pass, not to worry. Tuesday evening they were sitting in the living room. Mia had brought Thai food and they put on a movie that neither of them finished watching because Kevin went quiet in a way that wasn't his normal silence. It was a different silence, denser. "Are you okay?" asked Mia, lowering the volume. "I think so," said Kevin, but as he said it he felt something strange in his chest, a pressure that wasn't exactly pain but wasn't anything he had felt before either. "Kevin. I'm fine, it's just." He didn't finish the sentence. The pressure increased suddenly and spread to his left arm with a speed that left no room for analysis. Kevin doubled forward with an involuntary sound and Mia was already on her feet before he finished doubling over. "Kevin, what's wrong, Kevin?" "I don't know," he managed to say, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears, as if it were coming from deeper inside than usual. Mia had the phone in her hand. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers but with a voice she managed to keep steady when they answered. "I need an ambulance, my boyfriend is very sick, he has pain in his chest and his arm, he's sweating, please hurry." She gave the address. She repeated the apartment number twice. She hung up and went to kneel beside Kevin, who was now lying back on the sofa with a pallor that froze Mia's stomach in a way she would not easily forget. "They're coming, love, they're coming," she said, taking his hand. "The door," said Kevin with difficulty. "What?" "Open the door so they can get in quickly." Mia ran to open the apartment door. She left it completely open and returned to Kevin. The cold light of the corridor came in from the hallway, and somewhere in the building a door was heard opening. Mia paid no attention. Her eyes were fixed on Kevin, counting his breaths, talking to him to keep him awake and present. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes that felt to Mia like 9 hours. There were 2 of them. They came in quickly with a stretcher and a bag, and within minutes were assessing Kevin with that calm efficiency that only comes with practice. "How long has he had the pain?" asked one of them, a man with a deep voice named James according to the badge on his uniform. "About 10 minutes, replied Mia. "Is it his heart?" "We're going to stabilize him first," said James, confirming neither one way nor the other, and that was enough to make Mia's throat tighten. They brought Kevin down on the stretcher. Mia grabbed her purse, Kevin's keys, his phone, and rushed out behind them with such urgency that she didn't think about the door. She didn't think about anything except Kevin, the ambulance, getting to the hospital. The door of 4B was left open. And in the hallway, 3 doors opened almost at the same time. What happened in the following 2 hours at the hospital was a mixture of forms, waiting in hard chairs, doctors who spoke quickly, and Mia trying to understand everything while her hands trembled. The diagnosis was a severe arrhythmia complicated by extreme exhaustion and dehydration. It wasn't a heart attack, but it could have been. They stabilized him, connected him to monitors, and put him under observation. When Mia was finally able to see him, Kevin was in a bed with an IV in his arm and an expression of exhaustion so deep it seemed as though he were paying off years of debt. "Hi," he said when he saw her come in. "Hi," she replied, and she sat beside him and took his hand and said nothing more for a while because there was no need. It was nearly 3 hours later, when it was already the early hours of the morning and Kevin was sleeping with the monitors beeping softly at his rhythm, that Mia remembered the door. The memory arrived suddenly, like a stone dropped in water. She went out to the hospital hallway and called the number of the second-floor neighbor Kevin had mentioned to her once, an older woman named Rosa who lived in 4D and who was the only person on that floor Kevin described with something resembling affection. Rosa answered on the 3rd ring in a sleepy voice. "Rosa, it's Mia, Kevin's girlfriend from 4B. Sorry for the hour. Kevin is in the hospital and we left in such a hurry that we left the door open. Could you go close it?" There was a pause. "Oh, dear God, what happened to the boy?" "He's okay, he's already stable, but the door." "I'm going right now," said Rosa, and Mia heard the sound of slippers on a wooden floor. 3 minutes later Rosa called back. Her voice had changed. "Mia, dear, the door isn't just open." "What?" "The apartment has been turned upside down. Things are thrown around. The television is gone. There are open drawers, broken glass. This wasn't just a door left open." Mia took 2 seconds to process what she was hearing. "Should I call the police?" Rosa asked. "Yes," said Mia. "Call now." She hung up. She stood for a moment in the hospital hallway with her phone in her hand and a rage so cold and so clean it was almost frightening. Then she breathed, went back into Kevin's room, looked at his sleeping face, and made a decision. She wasn't going to tell him anything until he was better, but she also wasn't going to let this go without consequences, not this time. The police arrived at the building that same night. 2 officers took the initial report with Rosa as an eyewitness. She described what she had seen with that quiet precision that some older people have who have learned to observe the world carefully. "When I went to close the door, I heard voices inside," Rosa said. "I thought it was the television, but the television wasn't there. The voices were coming from people who were still inside." "Did you see them?" asked one of the officers. "I saw one run out through the hallway when he heard me opening the door. It was Danny, from 3B. I've known him for years, I'm not mistaken." "Only him?" Rosa hesitated for a moment. "I saw him, but there was more noise inside than one person makes." The officers noted everything down. They photographed the apartment. They drew up a preliminary inventory of damages: the 55-inch television Kevin had bought in installments over the course of a year, the work laptop, the sound system, cash he kept in a box in the closet, clothing, a watch that had belonged to his father, and a level of destruction that went beyond theft. Drawers emptied onto the floor. Pictures torn from the walls. Mia's aloe vera plant knocked to the floor with soil scattered everywhere. The bathroom mirror broken. It was as if, beyond taking things, they had also wanted to leave a message. Mia arrived at the apartment the next day, while Kevin was still under observation in the hospital. She walked in and stood in the living room looking at the wreckage with the kind of silent pain that finds no way out because it's too large to fit into words. Then she took out her phone and began photographing absolutely everything. Every overturned drawer. Every mark on the wall. Every broken object. She documented it with the thoroughness of someone who has decided that this is going to have consequences. She thought of Kevin's notebook, his folder on the computer, all those years of meticulous records, and felt something resembling retroactive gratitude. Kevin had spent years building, without quite knowing it, exactly what they were going to need now. She called a lawyer that same morning. His name was Lucas. He was a friend of her cousin, and when Mia told him everything in a 20-minute call, Lucas went quiet and then said, "Do you have records of the years of prior harassment?" 8 years, said Mia. Another silence. Good. That changes everything. Kevin left the hospital 4 days later with medication, instructions to rest, and the information Mia had been holding back until the doctors said he was ready. She told him that afternoon, sitting in the living room of the apartment they had cleaned and reorganized as best they could, with the empty space where the television had been staring at them like an open wound in the wall. Kevin listened to everything without interrupting. Mia showed him the photos, the police report, the notes she had taken from the conversation with Rosa. When she finished, Kevin stayed quiet for a long moment. "Rosa saw them?" he finally asked. "Danny directly, and she heard more people inside." Kevin nodded slowly. Then he got up, went to the bedroom, and came back with a thick folder that Mia recognized immediately. 8 years, he said, setting it on the table. "It's all here." Lucas received them in his office 3 days later. He was a man of around 40 with the face of someone who had heard many difficult stories in the capacity, which Mia deeply appreciated, not to look pitying while he listened. He went through Kevin's folder page by page while Kevin and Mia waited. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Do you know how many people should be keeping this kind of record?" "I don't know if I did it right," said Kevin. "You did it perfectly. Dates, specific descriptions, photos when available, audio recordings." Lucas closed the folder and looked at them both. "We're going to need several things. First, Rosa's testimony. Second, the recordings from the building's camera system, if there's anything that was useful that night. Third, an expert to assess the material damages. And fourth, your medical history related to the event, because we're going to argue that the chronic stress caused by these neighbors directly contributed to your health collapse." Kevin looked at him. "Can that be argued?" "With the documented history you have, and with a doctor to back it up, yes. It's not the central argument, but it reinforces the pattern of sustained harm." Lucas set the folder on the desk. "This isn't just a case of theft with damages, Kevin. It's sustained harassment over 8 years culminating in a crime of opportunity. That carries a different weight." The following weeks were a slow, methodical effort that Kevin approached with the same quiet patience he had used to survive the previous 8 years, only now with a clear purpose and with Mia by his side. Rosa agreed to testify without hesitating for a single second. She was a 72-year-old woman with an elephant's memory and a completely justified indignation she had no interest in concealing. "They've been making that young man's life impossible for years," she told Lucas when he came to take her formal statement. "And I've seen them. I've heard them. I have more than you think." It turned out that Rosa had been keeping her own informal record, not as systematic as Kevin's, but a notebook where she had written down the dates of the most serious episodes, because, as she said with complete naturalness, she did it just in case it might be useful someday. "See," Mia said to Kevin that night, "you weren't the only one keeping evidence." The building's cameras were the next step. The administrator, Torres, the same as always, with the same gray jacket, initially tried to claim that the system hadn't recorded anything useful that night due to a technical problem. Lucas looked at him steadily and explained, calmly but with a precision that left no room for ambiguity, that obstructing a criminal investigation had specific consequences. Torres went pale and suddenly recalled that there was indeed a backup copy on an external server that could be reviewed. The footage showed, with sufficient quality to be useful, 3 figures entering apartment 4B between 11:47 at night and 1:23 in the morning on the night in question. The figures were carrying objects as they left. One of them, the one who came out first when Rosa opened the door, was identifiable by his height, his gait, and the distinctive jacket Danny wore almost every day and that several neighbors could confirm. The other 2 figures were harder to identify due to the camera angle, but one had Marco's build and hair, and the other was leading the same dogs Sandra walked. 2 dark silhouettes pulling at leashes visible at the edge of the frame. The expert valued the material damages at a figure Kevin read twice because he didn't want to believe that number represented years of his work. His father's watch, declared an irreplaceable sentimental object, added a dimension that the lawyer deployed with surgical precision in the argument. The doctor who had treated Kevin in the hospital, after reviewing the history and speaking with Lucas, drafted a report establishing a connection between sustained chronic stress and the arrhythmia. He did not declare it a direct cause, but did name it a significant contributing factor, and that was enough. The 3 neighbors were summoned by the police. Marco arrived at the first summons looking as though it were all a misunderstanding, with an attitude that visibly changed when the detective in charge placed the camera footage and Rosa's statement on the table. Sandra arrived with a public defender and spent most of the interrogation saying she didn't know anything. Danny was the most interesting. He arrived alone, without a lawyer, with that bored expression that was his default, and went silent when they showed him the footage. Then he asked to speak with a lawyer, which was his right, but the prior silence had already said quite a lot. The trial was 4 months later. It was not the quick, cinematic process that appears in television series. It was slow, technical, full of legal terms that Kevin and Mia learned as they went, and emotionally exhausting in a way neither of them had fully anticipated. Lucas had prepared them well. He had explained that the objective was twofold: civil liability for the material damages and the 8 years of sustained harm, and criminal liability for the theft and destruction. The 2 proceedings ran in parallel and fed into each other. On the first day of the trial, Kevin walked into the courtroom with the 8-year folder under his arm and sat beside Lucas with that calm Mia had come to recognize as his most focused version of himself. Marco, Sandra, and Danny were on the other side of the room with their respective lawyers. Marco looked straight ahead with a carefully studied neutral expression. Sandra looked at her hands. Danny looked at Kevin, and Kevin held his gaze until Danny was the first to look away. Rosa testified with a clarity and firmness that silenced the room. She described the night of the robbery in minute detail, described 8 years of observed incidents, and when Marco's defense attorney tried to discredit her by insinuating that her memory might not be reliable given her age, Rosa looked at him with an expression so serene and so absolutely lethal that the judge had to suppress a smile. "Young man," Rosa said, "I am 72 years old and I remember exactly what I had for breakfast on the day I saw your client scratch Kevin's car in the parking lot. Would you like me to tell you the date as well?" The attorney moved on to the next question. The camera footage was presented with the analysis of a technical expert who established the identity of the figures to the required standard. The medical report was presented and explained. Kevin's folder was entered as an exhibit and Lucas used it to build a timeline that clearly demonstrated the sustained pattern of harassment and its escalation up to the final event. Kevin testified on the third day. He spoke for nearly 2 hours in that calm voice Mia loved and that in that context sounded more powerful precisely because of its composure. He used no drama. He didn't need to. The facts, presented in order and with documentary support, were sufficiently eloquent on their own. When the defense attorney asked why he had waited 8 years to take legal action, Kevin thought over the answer for a moment. "Because I hoped they would stop," he said, "and because until now I didn't have all the evidence I needed. And because knowing something and being able to prove it are two different things." There was a silence in the room after that. The verdict came on a rainy Friday, 6 weeks after the start of the trial. Kevin and Mia were sitting together when the judge read the resolution. Lucas was to Kevin's left, with that professional expression that doesn't celebrate before its time. All three guilty. Aggravated robbery with destruction of property. Marco and Danny received prison sentences of 3 years with the possibility of parole at 18 months, taking into account their records and the gravity of the offenses. Sandra received 2 years with the possibility of parole at 1 year, her participation having been proven though to a lesser degree of direct involvement. All three were jointly ordered to pay the material damages valued by the expert, plus additional compensation for emotional harm that the judge established taking into account the documented 8-year pattern. Kevin listened to everything without moving. When the judge finished speaking and Lucas extended his hand with a smile he now allowed himself, Kevin shook it, then turned to Mia and she embraced him right there, in that room smelling of old paper and varnished wood, and he let her without saying anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Outside it was raining. They left the courthouse building in the rain and Kevin raised his face toward the gray sky for a moment, eyes closed and water falling on his skin, and Mia watched him and thought it was the first time in a long while that she had seen him completely still, completely at peace. "How do you feel?" she asked. Kevin lowered his face, looked at her, and smiled in that way he had, calm and without excess. "Like I want to go home," he said. And they went. Apartment 4B remained Kevin's apartment. They got a new television, not the same model but a different one, because Kevin didn't want an exact copy of what had been taken from him. Mia's aloe vera plant was replaced by 2 new plants placed on the windowsill, one on each side. The bathroom mirror was replaced. His father's watch never came back, and that was the only loss the compensation money couldn't truly repair, but Kevin accepted it with that quiet maturity of his and put the photograph of the watch in the same folder where he had kept 8 years of evidence, now closed and filed away at the back of a drawer. Rosa invited them to dinner the following month, at her apartment in 4D which smelled of cinnamon and had plants in every corner. She cooked entirely by herself, made them sit at the table as if they were family, and over dinner talked about her own years in that building, about neighbors who had come and gone, about the texture of places that are inhabited for a long time. "The good thing about truly living somewhere," said Rosa, serving more soup without asking, "is that the place ends up being yours even if people tried to take that right away from you." Kevin looked at his plate, then at Mia, then at Rosa. "Yes," he said, "I think you're right." That night, walking back to 4B along the hallway that now felt different, lighter, as if the air had changed composition, Kevin took out his keys, opened the door, went inside, and closed it behind them both with that small, definitive sound that doors make when they close properly. The sound of someone who had come home. The journey doesn't end here. If you want to keep discovering more stories and surprises, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. I promise what's coming next will be even more exciting. See you in the next chapter.